And with me in the studio, Marc Perelman. Marc, are we expecting some kind of concrete text to come out of this summit today?
It would seem so, just because of the draft that was mentioned in Emerald's report. The draft was leaked to our colleagues from Reuters and AFP, and it seems to indicate that there should be a text at the end of this meeting, a coalition of the meeting for the first time with U.S. participation. And obviously, there is a willingness not to have meeting after meeting after meeting without concrete things happening on paper and then hopefully on the ground. And so the idea now is to have U.S. involvement and European boots on the ground in case there is a ceasefire. It's obviously still a hypothesis, but the idea that there would be a ceasefire monitoring and verification mechanism led by the United States with European participation would be progress, because it would show that there would be coordination, that there would essentially be a key U.S. role for monitoring an eventual ceasefire and possible peace deal. There would also, however, be a European-led multinational force deployed to Ukraine if there is to be a ceasefire. That is still the idea. We know that France and the UK, especially, have already committed to sending such troop in the event there is a ceasefire. But the idea that Washington would commit to support, according to the draft, this force in case of a Russian attack also is something that Europeans wanted. There's been a lot of talk about, it's a bit technical, about a U.S. backstop, really to support this force if it goes into Ukraine, because the U.S. has capability, especially air defense, especially intelligence, that European countries do not have, especially collectively. So the idea that the U.S. would, if not be on the ground, at least in the air and supporting that force in case of a Russian attack would seem to be progress. The problem is, if there is a Russian attack, obviously this means the peace would crumble. What's also in the draft statement is the notion of binding commitments to support Ukraine. Obviously, we know that Ukraine wants ironclad commitments akin to Article 5 of the NATO treaty, whereby an attack against a member of the alliance is an attack against all, and this means that all are called to react. We know Ukraine is not going to be a member of NATO. The Trump administration has said so, the Biden administration already, but less vocally so. So Ukraine is hoping that the Europeans, the Americans, are going to put on paper exactly what those binding commitments would be if Russia was to attack again. It's still being worked out, but that's what should come out of this meeting. Obviously, the big question mark is, what would Russia do? Because this would imply Russia agreeing. We've been now monitoring this back and forth between the drafts submitted by the U.S., then by the Europeans, then by Ukraine. President Zelensky says, we're getting there, 90% there, but we're still not there, especially because the Kremlin has not indicated that it is willing to accept, first of all, a ceasefire, and even more so a peace deal, unless Ukraine accepts to make major concessions, especially territorial concessions. Kiev has said no for now.
And your thoughts then on, we were just looking, some of the footage behind you of Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff, two top advisors to Donald Trump, who are in Paris today. I believe this is the first time they've attended one of these coalition of the willing summits. How significant is that?
It is significant. They are not formally members of the Trump administration. None of them has a formal role, but they do have a key role in the odd ways of the Trump White House. Obviously, Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff are there. Why? Not so much because they were involved in the deal with Gaza, but because they sat for several hours in front of Vladimir Putin recently in Moscow. and everyone was wondering why were they there. But obviously, they were seen as the voice and the ears of Donald Trump with Vladimir Putin. And so the fact that they're today in Paris is probably a way for all the other members of the coalition of the willing, mostly European countries, but also Canada, Australia, and Japan, for instance, to have their feedback from those who met recently with Vladimir Putin to try to see what concrete progress can be made. It doesn't mean that we'll solve everything today, but the fact that the U.S. is at the table, especially in the wake of the events in Venezuela, it's also a way for the U.S. administration. Yes, Marco Rubio, who was supposed to attend, is not there. Donald Trump nowhere to be seen, of course. But they are nevertheless willing to send the signal that it's not because they're busy by what's happening in Caracas that they're ditching the Ukraine file and letting the Europeans try to deal with it on their own against Vladimir Putin. That doesn't mean that they are still not more favorable to Russia than Ukraine, according to some observers, and to the fear of the Ukrainian leadership. But it's still there at the table. We'll have to see whether this will bring concrete results once again.